Good evening. You think dating is hard now? Try doing it without soap, or privacy, or the concept of mutual consent. But first, good evening, and welcome to Soft History to Sleep. If you've stumbled in looking for a quiet escape from the modern world, or from your own dating disasters, you're in the right place. Here, the pace is slow. The torchlight is flickering. And absolutely no one is texting you back, because it's 12:30 and literacy is a luxury. So before we begin, find your comfiest position. Let your jaw unclench. Maybe throw a blanket over your shoulder like it's a medieval cloak and you're about to go spy on your crush through the castle gardens. And if you enjoy gentle, strange journeys through the past, filled with questionable hygiene and poor romantic decisions, please follow the channel. It helps more than you know, and ensures you never miss another mildly depressing bedtime story. Also tell us what time it is for you now, and where you're located. It's comforting to know that there are more people awake at this time of the night. Here in the castle, where I've worked longer than anyone bothers to count, love is not a soft, sweet sonnet whispered under moonlight. It's more like a political agreement sealed with livestock. Or a scandal involving a stable boy, 3 flagons of mead, and someone forgetting to lock the door. Welcome to the real story of medieval romance. You're probably expecting courtly love, harp music, maybe a stolen kiss in the garden? No. You're getting chamber pots, pregnancy math, and moral panic. Because for us peasants, there were no roses. Just chores, and consequences. But before you judge too harshly, I'll remind you. At least we never had to pretend to like someone's podcast just to get a date. Now, settle in. Maybe light a candle. And thank your ancestors for inventing deodorant. We're about to walk you through what forbidden love, and very messy attraction, actually looked like in 1230. And trust me, it's not what the ballads promised. If you thought love was confusing in your time, with your swipes and emojis and eye contact anxiety, you should have tried it in mine. Back then, we didn't really date. We negotiated. Or rather, our parents did. With goats. And land. Let's say you're a young maiden of decent stock, meaning your family has at least 1 cow, a good roof, and nobody's been accused of witchcraft lately. You're about 12, maybe 13. That's prime marrying age, by the way. Because nothing says long-term compatibility like a girl who still collects river stones for fun. Your parents are desperate to see you married off before winter. Why? Because food is tight, your dowry's not getting bigger, and frankly, they need one less mouth to feed. The dowry, by the way, is your family's little bundle of incentives. A few coins if they have them. A chicken or 2. Maybe a goat. Or even a small piece of cloth, if your mother's been weaving by candlelight. It's not so much a gift as it is a bribe to make you someone else's problem. The more valuable the dowry, the better your prospects. Which, for the record, were still not great. So along comes a boy. He has both his front teeth and a pig of his own. Jackpot. The fathers shake hands. Maybe the priest is there. Maybe not. Maybe someone remembered to ask you what you think. But probably not. Suddenly, you're a wife. Your doll becomes firewood. Your chores double. And by spring, you're probably pregnant. Not very romantic, is it? And if you're a boy, well, good luck. Unless you're the firstborn son with a plot of land to inherit, you're mostly decoration. You'll marry if your parents can trade you off, but otherwise, enjoy sleeping in the barn until your father dies or a cousin gets trampled by an ox and leaves you a goat. Now, the nobles. Oh, they like to pretend it was all poetry and handkerchiefs. But even up there, marriage was just land grabbing with extra lace. Daughters were assets, moved like chess pieces to secure alliances. Dowries came in the form of gold, titles, or property. Entire villages were sometimes included. And while the poor might offer a goat, the rich might offer a castle with light draughts and one very moody falconer. Young noble ladies were married off at 12 or 13 to men twice, sometimes 3 times, their age. Alliances, titles, and heirs mattered more than affection. Love, if it happened, was purely accidental, and usually inconvenient. If a noble girl dared to love someone outside her class, well, let's just say the tower had great acoustics for weeping. You want to know what the ceremony was like? It was short. Very short. As in, do you agree? Yes. Do you agree? Yes. Done. Now go make heirs. And in case you were wondering, no, there was no kiss at the altar. No bouquet toss. And definitely no arguing about napkin colors. Most people were just hoping the bread wouldn't be stale. The church, of course, had its say. It liked to remind everyone that marriage was sacred, holy, and not to be entered into lightly. But they also approved of most matches as long as the tithes were paid. Also, no marrying your cousin. Unless you were rich. Then it was strongly discouraged, but quietly ignored. Love letters? Ha! If your beloved could write, maybe you'd get a note. Otherwise, your token of affection was a carved spoon or a rabbit pelt. You wore it tucked into your bodice and pretended you weren't itchy. As for expressing interest, there were no compliments. No sweet whispers. Maybe a nod. If you were really bold, a smile. Too much flirting could get you accused of being forward, which in many towns meant you were a moral danger to society. In short, making eye contact was practically foreplay. Did people fall in love? Yes. Just not the way you think. It wasn't candlelit dinners or romantic strolls. It was shared suffering. Plowing the same field. Fetching water from the same muddy stream. Surviving together. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes, it wasn't. And when love didn't fit into the neat boxes of duty and survival, well, that's when the secret started. But we'll get to that. For now, rest your eyes. Let the candlelight flicker behind your lids. And think of that poor girl who traded dolls for diapers, and that poor boy who traded dreams for someone else's inheritance. Because in 1230, love wasn't blind. It was arranged. Great catch. The dowry detail was in the earlier version and deserves a fuller, richer treatment, especially since it shaped so much of medieval marriage and courtship across classes. Here's an updated version of Segment 3, now expanded to include a thorough, and still entertaining, explanation of dowries, keeping the same tone and structure we developed, with the temporary seriousness for sensitive topics like contraception and chastity myths. They say love always finds a way. That may be true. But in 1230, love usually had to sneak through the kitchen, dodge the chamber pot, and hope your father wasn't up sharpening tools by candlelight. Because once you were married, especially if you were a woman, your personal desires were no longer part of the conversation. But before the vows, before the priest, before you even had a chance to form an opinion on the boy from the neighboring village, there was the matter of the dowry. Yes, the dowry. The medieval version of a dating profile, except instead of likes long walks and music, it comes with 2 goats and a sturdy cauldron. A dowry was the sum, in animals, land, tools, textiles, or coins, that a bride's family paid the groom's family upon marriage. It wasn't a gift. It was a transaction. A way of saying, here, take our daughter. We've packed her lunch and prepaid for her inconvenience. Among peasants, a dowry might include a sheep, a storage chest, or enough wool to make a blanket. Among nobles, acres of land, titles, or whole fortresses might be exchanged, especially if the bride came from a powerful family. And yes, the bigger the dowry, the better the husband. No dowry? Well, enjoy your lifelong career as that unmarried aunt who helps with chores and talks to birds. Once that dowry was handed over and hands were shaken, the expectations were locked in. Love didn't factor in. Compatibility was irrelevant. It was about property, alliances, survival. And if the marriage turned cold, or violent, there were few options. You didn't return the dowry. And you didn't get out. Which leads us, of course, to what happened outside the contract. Because human hearts, and bodies, have never been especially good at sticking to contracts. Let's begin with the nobles. Affairs? Oh yes. Often. Noblemen were practically expected to have mistresses, especially once their wives had delivered a male heir, or, better yet, two. These affairs were orchestrated with style. Secret couriers. Late-night poetry. Walks in walled gardens that lasted suspiciously longer than they should have. And noble women? Well, it was harder. Far riskier. But don't assume they were all lonely saints. Some sought affection beyond their husbands, if they had loyal servants and tight-lipped midwives. If caught, though, the consequences could be brutal: loss of title, exile, or even execution for treason. Because female desire was seen as a threat, not just to morality, but to lineage. Downstairs, among the workers and villagers, things were simpler and rougher. No privacy. No satin sheets. Just haylofts, bakehouses, or a stolen moment during berry picking. Encounters happened quickly, awkwardly, and often without ceremony. Feelings were optional. Survival was not. Now, let's slow the sarcasm. Because behind the giggles and scandal lies something serious: how people try to protect themselves from unintended consequences. Yes. Even in 1230. They knew. They didn't have biology textbooks, but they had observations, midwives, and centuries of whispered experience. Herbal methods were common, passed from woman to woman, especially through midwives. Pennyroyal, tansy, wild carrot seed. Some acted as amenagogues, meant to bring on a late cycle. Others were risky, even toxic in large amounts. But they were used. Quietly. Regularly. Timing methods existed too, guessing safe days in a cycle. Crude barriers made from animal intestines or waxed cloth were rare, but did exist. Mostly, though, prevention was left to herbs and luck. Now let's address the elephant in the castle. The chastity belt. There is no credible evidence that women in the Middle Ages were forced to wear iron undergarments locked in place by their husbands. Most of the objects you've seen in museums or books were made centuries later, usually as novelty items, political satire, or misguided reenactments. The idea that you could wear a metal device 24/7, without infection or injury, is as absurd as it sounds. Historians now agree, the chastity belt was more legend than reality. It captured imaginations later on, especially in the Victorian era, which had a talent for inventing strange fantasies about the past. In truth, the only belts most women wore were made of cloth and meant for holding tools. In truth, controlling women's behavior didn't require metal. It required rules. And watching. And a whole community trained to shame or punish any girl who stepped out of line. So no chastity belts. The devices you've seen, most of them were made in the 1800s, as jokes, propaganda, or macabre curiosities for museums. But endless, exhausting control? That was very real. And if something did happen? If a servant girl started walking slower in the morning? If the baker's wife suddenly stopped helping lift sacks of grain? The midwife knew. She always knew. And usually, she kept a secret. Because in 1230, love didn't just have to be hidden. Sometimes, it had to be protected. You'd be forgiven for imagining medieval intimacy as something cloaked in mystery, conducted behind thick velvet curtains in candlelit chambers. But in most cases, it wasn't like that at all. Because in the 13th century, privacy was a luxury, and most people never tasted it. In villages and castles alike, people lived communally. Servants shared sleeping quarters, sometimes beds. Entire families might sleep in the same room, on rush-covered floors, near the hearth for warmth. A single chamber might hold a nursing infant, an aging grandmother, and a courting couple, all at once. So how, then, did closeness even happen? The answer: carefully. Moments of affection, emotional or physical, were rare and often stolen. They happened in corners of barns, wooded paths, or during festivals, when the watchful eye of community life was briefly distracted by celebration. We know from court records that relationships developed gradually, and often within strict bounds. There were church rules about when relations were permitted: never during Lent, never on Sundays, not during menstruation or pregnancy, and never in daylight. The church prescribed not only when, but how, insisting that certain acts were sinful, others tolerable, and that all must be done with procreative intent. Despite these rules, there was warmth. There was longing. We find glimpses of this in folk songs, court poetry, and pastoral tales that speak of touches beneath cloaks, whispered meetings by moonlight, or shared tokens like handkerchiefs, lockets, or carved spoons. Even the manuscripts of the time, illuminated by monks, occasionally include small, subversive illustrations of lovers meeting in the margins. They were subtle reminders that desire existed, even among the pages of saints' lives. For nobles, the etiquette of affection was guided by courtly love, an idealized, often unconsummated admiration of a noblewoman, usually by a knight or troubadour. This was less about physical intimacy and more about ritualized devotion, pledges, poems, glances from across the banquet table. But for commoners, it was simpler, more tactile. It was the boy who walked a girl home after the fair. The girl who saved an extra portion of stew. A hand on the back, a smile held too long. We know from legal documents that women often negotiated affection through domestic roles. A woman might agree to share a bed in exchange for a promise of marriage, and if the man broke it, she could take him to court. These cases survive in medieval court rolls, full of testimony from neighbors who heard, saw, or suspected what happened. And here's something often overlooked. Touch was rare. In a society where the body was seen as shameful, where baths were infrequent, and clothing rarely removed, the act of touching skin, of seeing another person undressed, was startlingly intimate. Not just physical, emotional. Even within marriage, those moments were often short and functional. There were duties to fulfill, pregnancies to avoid or endure, and little time left for tenderness. So when tenderness did occur, it mattered. Not because it was grand or poetic, but because it was quiet. Because it had to be earned. And because in a world of chores, rules, and watchful eyes, those brief seconds of real connection were precious. Perfect. We'll bring back that charmingly exasperated voice of our narrator, sprinkle in some modern comparisons, and deepen the sensory, historical, and emotional content in the next segment. Here's the beginning of Let's Talk About Cleanliness. Or rather, let's talk about the absence of it. Because if you're imagining medieval romance with flowing hair, freshly scrubbed skin, and the gentle scent of lavender, stop right there. Now picture a crowded hall. Everyone's wearing at least 3 layers of wool. It's the middle of February. The fire's low. And someone in the corner is skinning a rabbit. That is the aroma in which most courtship began. We didn't have deodorant. Or running water. We had hope. And herbs. And a lot of deep denial. Now to be fair, people did bathe. That myth about nobody bathing is exactly that, a myth. Medieval people knew dirt carried disease. They liked to wash when they could. Servants hauled in buckets of water, warmed them near the hearth, and filled wooden tubs that were shared, first come, least filthy. In towns and cities, there were even public bathhouses, especially in the earlier part of the Middle Ages. You'd pay a small fee, step into a steamy room, and bathe in a giant communal tub, usually with strangers. Not exactly romantic, but occasionally eventful. Some bathhouses doubled as places of business. Not that kind of business, though, well, sometimes also that. But mostly they were hubs for news, gossip, and accidental meetings between those who probably shouldn't be seen together. And what did people smell like? Let's just say, earthy. Wool absorbs odors. Shoes were rarely changed. Teeth were cleaned with frayed sticks and ashes. And hair was washed, when absolutely necessary. The lucky ones combed rosemary or sage oil through their braids. The rest of us tried not to breathe too deeply. So yes, attraction existed, but it was adjusted for the context. No one expected a clean-shaven chin or citrus-scented wrists. You judged a person by their hands, calloused or soft. By how they carried a bucket. By whether they had all their toes. And if they did? Well, they were practically a heartthrob. Now let's talk scent. Did we wear perfume? Yes. Sort of. We wore pomanders, little metal balls filled with herbs, pinned to clothes or tucked inside sleeves. We carried satchels of dried lavender. And if you were noble, you might dab rose water behind your ears, or on your letter to a lover. But for most of us, a fresh-smelling person meant they'd just been near the apothecary. Or maybe they fell into the river. Here's where things get more tragic. First impressions mattered. But in a world where people married within their parish, saw each other daily, and were almost always covered head to toe, attraction had little to do with appearance. And almost nothing to do with hygiene. It was about shared rhythm. Matching footsteps on the walk to the market. The way their voice rose during prayer. How they passed the ladle at supper without spilling. We fell for each other slowly. Awkwardly. And, often, despite the smell. Now compare that to your world. Where a single swipe left ends a budding romance. Where dating apps filter out anyone who doesn't floss twice a day or exfoliate. Where a lack of eye contact is grounds for emotional ghosting. Back then, eye contact was rare. Mostly because we were too busy looking down to avoid chicken droppings. So yes, you have it hard. But imagine trying to woo someone in a room full of livestock, with a boil on your chin, and only one shirt. Now you understand medieval romance. Absolutely, here's a richer, more flowing rewrite of segment 6, bringing back the narrator's delightfully exasperated tone, deeper historical detail, more relatable modern comparisons, and less choppiness between ideas. The goal is to be immersive, amusing, and engaging, like being told a secret by someone who knows way too much about everyone. If you've ever worked in an office, lived in a dorm, or tried to keep your personal life private in a small town, then congratulations, you already understand medieval castle life. Only take those nosy co-workers, multiply their curiosity by 10, subtract the HR department, and add a full-time kitchen staff, 24 stable boys, and a chapel choir that can't keep its mouth shut. Now you're getting closer. You see, the castle had walls, thick, stone, drafty things. But they didn't need to have ears. The people inside did the listening. We didn't have texts or emails or group chats, but we had eyes, and we had mouths, and we knew how to use both. Rumors traveled faster than any messenger, and gossip had legs longer than a jousting pole. The cooks heard everything, because everyone talked near the hearth. The laundresses saw everything, because every secret eventually ended up in a shirt. The pages knew who was coming and going, literally, and the grooms in the stables were the last to see anyone before they disappeared into the woods for a walk. Even I, your humble narrator, saw more forbidden glances and misbuttoned tunics than I ever asked for. I tried not to judge. I also tried not to get fired. Now, don't get the wrong idea, most people weren't exactly living out medieval romance novels. Relationships weren't about passion. They were about power, position, survival, and, if you were really lucky, someone who didn't smell too strongly of turnips. And yet, despite the complete lack of privacy and the very real threat of scandal, people still found ways to fall in love. Or at least to fall into something inconvenient. Of course, for nobles, everything was about discretion. A noblewoman couldn't so much as drop a ribbon without someone suspecting she was about to throw away her entire family's future. And if she actually did something scandalous? Oh, the fallout could be swift and brutal. She could be sent away to a convent, have her children declared illegitimate, or worse, become the subject of an especially pointed church sermon that everyone would pretend wasn't about her. Meanwhile, her husband might take a mistress, have a bastard, and still be asked to carve the roast at dinner. So yes, double standards? Alive and thriving. Among the servants, things were a little more relaxed, but not by much. The problem was less about politics and more about survival. If two stable hands got caught sneaking off together, one of them could be dismissed, no references, no wages. If a kitchen maid ended up with a baby and no husband, she could be out on the road by nightfall. There were no protections. No maternity leave. No its complicated status. Just cold stone and colder consequences. And yet, somehow, affection still bloomed. In whispered jokes behind the hay carts. In the way someone wrapped an extra heel of bread in a cloth and left it where they knew you'd find it. In the quiet brush of hands when no one else was looking. You could always tell when something was going on. People moved differently. They spoke in half sentences. They started taking the long way to the kitchens. And when it all went wrong, which it often did, the entire castle knew before the hour was out. There were no big public arguments. No shouted "How could you?" across the courtyard. Just shifts in who sat where, who spoke to whom, and whether or not someone suddenly got reassigned to muck the stables alone. That was the medieval version of being unfollowed on Instagram. What made it worse was how visible everything was, and yet how little could be acknowledged. You couldn't ask someone what was going on. That would have been scandalous in itself. Instead, you waited for the breadline to shift, for someone to stop attending morning prayers, or for a scarf to change hands. And then you knew, you didn't say it, but you knew. For all its rules and restrictions, for all its freezing corridors and judgmental clergy, castle life was intensely human. Messy, complicated, and deeply, deeply curious. Behind every stone arch and straw mattress was a story someone didn't want told. And behind every one of those stories was someone like me, who knew it, watched it unfold, and absolutely could not be trusted to keep their mouth shut. Perfect, here's the revised segment 7, expanding into forbidden pairings with the narrator's deliciously exhausted tone, deeper historical insight, and comparisons that gently nudge the modern listener while unfolding the medieval social maze with just the right amount of bite and sympathy. Now, you might be wondering, what happened when love, or desire, or even just companionship didn't fall into the categories approved by fathers, priests, or marriage contracts? Well, first of all, congratulations. You've stumbled into one of the most heavily policed, least talked about, and most human parts of medieval life. Let's be clear, if you lived in a castle or village in the 1200s and your heart decided to rebel, say, fall for someone of the same gender, or someone from the wrong social class, or someone already locked in a sanctified union, well, that wasn't just risky. That was dangerous. Not metaphorically. Actually dangerous. See, the church had a long list of what was considered unnatural, sinful, or against God's order. And that list? It had very little to do with love, and everything to do with control. Marriage was about property, bloodlines, land, keeping families predictable and alliances intact. Anything outside that made people very nervous. Especially people with power. But here's the thing, even in the most rigid systems, human beings still find ways to notice each other. And medieval people, despite what the woodcuts would have you believe, weren't made of stone. They were just as prone to longing, confusion, and connection as anyone scrolling through dating apps today, just with less privacy and significantly more hay. Same-gender relationships? They existed. Of course they did. There are court records full of whispers and accusations, 2 nuns caught writing each other letters that weren't about scripture, 2 monks whose deep spiritual bond became a little too well known, young men who shared beds for warmth, and maybe more. Sometimes these connections were allowed to pass quietly. Sometimes they were punished harshly. It depended on who found out, and how badly that person needed to prove their piety that week. And love across class lines? Also common, and predictably disastrous. A stable boy falling for a noblewoman wasn't seen as romantic. It was seen as presumptuous. A kitchen maid catching the eye of the Lord? That wasn't a fairy tale. That was an HR violation, if castles had HR. They didn't. They had priests and whipping posts. Women had it worse, of course. If you were female and had feelings that didn't fit the church's mold, well, you had three options: marry someone you didn't choose, take a vow of chastity and disappear into a convent, or risk everything. And by everything, I mean your safety, your standing, and in some cases, your life. Because deviation from the norm was seen as dangerous. Contagious, even. The church liked to cloak all of this in divine wisdom, but underneath it, there was fear. Fear of what couldn't be controlled. Of desires that didn't serve the social order. Of bonds that weren't easily taxed or blessed or arranged between two landowning fathers. And so sermons were preached. Confessions were extracted. People were made examples of, not because they were wicked, but because they were inconvenient. But here's the uncomfortable truth: even with all the preaching, the surveillance, and the fear, it didn't stop people. Not entirely. Some still found ways to be together. A meeting by candlelight. A shared prayer that lingered too long. A letter tucked into a boot. Risky, reckless, and sometimes doomed, yes. But also, real. And as someone who's seen a lot from the shadows of these stone corridors, I can tell you, those forbidden moments? They shone brighter than all the sanctioned ones. Because when everything is against you, the walls, the rules, the sermons, even a glance can feel like a revolution. Excellent, here's segment 8, continuing with our hilariously weary narrator as he leads us into the absurd, risky, and very human ways people bent the rules, and the rather dramatic ways they got caught. Now, you might think that with all those rules, punishments, and ever-watchful eyes, people in the Middle Ages just gave up on romance altogether. No. Because here's something eternal about humans: if it's forbidden, we'll find a way to do it, but dramatically, and ideally in a way that leaves room for at least one tragic misunderstanding. So how did people in 1230 sneak around the crushing weight of church doctrine, family duty, and the total lack of private bedrooms? They got creative. Sometimes it was as simple as slipping out to the stables after nightfall. Horses are excellent listeners, by the way, and unlikely to tattle unless bribed with apples. Other times, it involved entire systems, code words carved into bread crusts, secret tunnels under convents, or, in one particularly infamous case, a young friar disguising himself as a laundress for 2 months just to spend time near a merchant's daughter. Spoiler: he was eventually caught when he couldn't properly wring out a tunic and the real laundress ratted him out. And yes, there were actual underground passageways in some places, built not just for escape during sieges, but occasionally used for other kinds of escape. The kind where a nobleman needed fresh air, and somehow emerged from a tunnel in the alehouse cellar 3 hours later smelling of perfume and questionable choices. Now, let's talk about what happened when people got caught. Today, if a couple breaks some unwritten rule, they get unfollowed, ghosted, or subtweeted. Maybe someone posts a long, vague Instagram story about betrayal. Back then, you could be shaved bald and paraded through town. Or branded. Or forced to walk barefoot around the churchyard for 40 days wearing a sign that said adulterer. If you were really unlucky, or female, you might be banished, beaten, locked in the stocks, or worse. There's a documented case from 1287 where a miller's wife was discovered having a secret relationship with a traveling monk. The monk was fined, given penance, and reassigned to a monastery in the woods. She, however, was publicly whipped and her family fined for raising a temptress. So no, there was no equality in punishment. Surprise. But still, people risked it. Because the heart is stubborn. And castle walls, no matter how thick, leak stories, secrets, footsteps in the snow. You know what we didn't have in 1230? Therapy. You got your emotional support from one of 3 places. Your sheep, highly unreliable. A neighbor who gossiped like it was a spiritual calling. Or a sympathetic monk who probably needed therapy himself. We didn't have dating apps. No one was filtering their best traits into a 5-second profile photo. You didn't swipe. You endured. And if you were lucky, very lucky, you endured next to someone who didn't make your life worse. And yet, amid all that, the rot, the rumors, the risk, people still hoped. Even the ones with the worst odds, the fewest options, the narrowest paths. Some say love is patient, love is kind. But in 1230, love was persistent. And a little bit reckless. And usually muddy. Wonderful. Here's the closing segment. So, after all this sneaking, sighing, marrying, suffering, longing, did anyone actually live happily ever after? Well, that depends on your definition. In fairy tales, the story ends with a kiss and a crown. But in real life, especially medieval real life, the story usually ended with sore feet, 6 children, and someone forgetting your name when you went to the market. And yet, there were moments. Moments that were quiet and ordinary, but somehow still sacred. A loaf of warm bread shared in silence. A hand held under the table when no one was watching. 2 voices humming the same hymn from opposite ends of the chapel. These were the love stories that survived not because they were grand, but because they were real. Resilient. Grounded in the mud and the mayhem. Now, I don't want to romanticize the past. It was brutal. Unequal. Deeply unfair. Especially to women, to servants, to anyone who didn't fit into the tidy roles assigned by the church or their last name. Most people didn't get to choose who they loved. Fewer still got to stay with them. And very, very few wrote their names down for future generations to remember. But maybe that's why we tell these stories. Maybe that's why I tell them, through cold stone corridors, past echoes of secrets and footsteps that barely left a mark. Because even if history forgot them, someone should remember that they tried. That somewhere, in the middle of all the rules and rot and religious sermons, someone looked across a crowded courtyard, and smiled. And now, if you're still awake, you've officially outlasted a medieval love triangle, 2 ill-advised elopements, and 1 unfortunate case of mistaken identity involving a goat and a window ladder. Not bad for a Tuesday. Before you drift off entirely, I'd love to know, what's the most surprising thing you learned tonight? Do you think you'd survive medieval dating? Or would you fake your own death and move to a monastery? Leave a comment, if your eyes are still open. And if you'd like more tales like this, ones that take their time, that whisper instead of shout, go ahead and subscribe. Because here, at Soft History to Sleep, we believe even the quietest stories deserve to be told. Good night. Sleep well. And may your dreams be free of muddy courtyards, angry in-laws, and church fines.